For much of the modern world, food security is explained through a familiar formula. Reliable harvests require irrigation. Yields depend on synthetic inputs. Stability comes from scale, infrastructure, and control. Crops that cannot be standardized, mechanized, or expanded are often treated as marginal, useful perhaps in theory, but insufficient in practice. And yet, history offers quiet contradictions to that logic. In parts of West Africa, a cereal grain was cultivated for centuries without irrigation, without fertilizers, and without mechanized tools. It matured in a matter of weeks, tolerated poor soils, and provided measurable nutritional value. It was not rare, experimental, or symbolic. It was ordinary food. Today, that crop is largely absent from global food systems, not because it vanished biologically, and not because its properties changed, but because the system around it did. The question is not what this crop lacked, but what the modern system required instead. For much of its history, fonio occupied a role that modern categories struggle to describe. It was not a luxury grain, nor a fallback reserved only for crisis. In large parts of the Sahel and Upper Guinea region, fonio was a staple, cultivated routinely, stored carefully, and relied upon when other crops failed. Archaeological evidence suggests its domestication dates back roughly 5,000 years, making it one of the oldest cultivated cereals on the African continent. Communities in what are now Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Senegal integrated fonio into seasonal cycles long before written records. It was planted at the onset of the rainy season, harvested quickly, and consumed fresh or stored dry. Its short growing period allowed households to bridge the gap between planting and the main harvests of slower crops. In years of irregular rainfall, fonio often provided the first dependable calories. Ethnographic records describe fonio as a famine reserve crop, but the term can be misleading. It was not cultivated only as insurance. In many regions, fonio held ceremonial importance, and it was served at weddings, funerals, and communal gatherings. Its preparation required skill and time, particularly the de-husking process, and that labor embedded it deeply in social life. Women were, in particular, custodians of this knowledge, passing techniques across generations. Early colonial accounts noted fonio's ubiquity without fully understanding its function. Administrators often described it as primitive or inefficient, not because it failed to feed people, but because it did not conform to European agricultural frameworks. Yet for centuries, fonio sustained populations in environments where imported cereals struggled. Its long continuity suggests not a marginal crop, but a system adapted to place, one that remained reliable precisely because it resisted simplification. When examined through a modern scientific lens, fonio's historical persistence begins to make measurable sense. Nutritionally, it does not behave like an inferior grain that survived only through necessity. Analyses of fonio grain show a protein content generally ranging between 8 and 10%, comparable to, and in some cases slightly higher than, polished rice. More significant than quantity, however, is quality. Fonio contains relatively high levels of sulfur-containing amino acids, particularly methionine and cysteine. These amino acids are often limited in other staple cereals such as maize, wheat, and rice. In traditional diets where animal protein was scarce or consumed irregularly, this characteristic mattered. It helped balance overall amino acid intake without requiring additional food sources. Agronomically, fonio is adapted to conditions that challenge most cereals. It requires minimal water once established and can grow on shallow, sandy, or degraded soils where other crops show sharp yield declines. Its root system is modest, reducing competition for water, while its rapid growth cycle, typically 6 to 8 weeks, limits exposure to drought stress. If rainfall is short or erratic, fonio often reaches maturity before failure becomes inevitable. Yields under traditional cultivation are modest by industrial standards, commonly reported between 600 and 1,000 kilograms per hectare. Yet yield alone does not capture its function. Fonio's value lay in reliability rather than maximization. It produced food quickly, with low risk, and without external inputs. No synthetic fertilizers were required. No irrigation infrastructure was necessary. Seed saving was straightforward. Research institutions such as FAO and CIRAD have documented these traits without framing fonio as exceptional or miraculous. Instead, they describe a crop optimized for environments defined by variability. By modern metrics, fonio performs precisely where failure is usually expected. The displacement of fonio did not occur because its biological traits were misunderstood. It occurred as agricultural systems themselves changed. Beginning in the late 19th century and accelerating through the early 20th, colonial administrations across West Africa reorganized food production around a different set of priorities. Crops were no longer evaluated primarily by how reliably they fed local populations, but by how efficiently they could be taxed, exported, and integrated into external markets. Grains such as rice, maize, and later wheat fit these requirements. They could be planted in uniform fields, harvested at scale, processed mechanically, and transported in bulk. Irrigation projects and centralized milling facilities reinforced their dominance. In regions like the Niger River Basin, large-scale schemes such as the Office du Niger prioritized irrigated rice cultivation, reshaping landscapes and labor patterns alike. Fonio did not align with this shift. Its small grain size complicated mechanized harvesting and milling. Its dehusking required time-intensive processing that resisted industrial simplification. Its yields varied with micro-conditions rather than responding predictably to inputs. From the perspective of colonial planners and later post-independence development models, these traits were liabilities. After independence, many West African governments inherited agricultural frameworks already oriented toward standardized cereals. International development programs reinforced the same logic, favoring crops that could be scaled quickly and measured easily. Fonio remained present in rural areas, but it increasingly fell outside formal policy, research funding, and infrastructure investment. The result was not a sudden abandonment, but a gradual marginalization. As systems optimized for throughput and uniformity expanded, crops optimized for resilience and speed lost institutional support. What scaled efficiently displaced what endured quietly. As fonio slipped out of formal agricultural planning, its identity began to change. What had once been a widely cultivated staple was gradually reclassified. In policy documents and research agendas, fonio was increasingly described as a minor crop, later grouped under labels such as traditional, local, and ultimately neglected and underutilized species. Each term appeared neutral, even respectful, but collectively, they signaled a withdrawal of attention. This rebranding had practical consequences. Crops categorized this way rarely receive sustained research funding. Breeding programs focus elsewhere. Infrastructure, from storage facilities to processing equipment, is designed around dominant grains. Over time, the absence of investment reinforces the perception that these crops are marginal by nature, rather than marginal by design. Dietary prestige shifted as well. Urbanization across West Africa accelerated throughout the 20th century, bringing new food preferences shaped by colonial influence and global trade. Imported rice, often subsidized, became associated with modernity and convenience. Fonio, which required time-intensive processing and local knowledge, came to be seen as old-fashioned or rural. Younger generations encountered it less frequently, and when they did, it was often in ceremonial contexts rather than daily meals. The labor involved in fonio processing, traditionally managed by women, also became a factor in its decline. As economic pressures increased, time-consuming food preparation competed with wage labor and schooling. Skills that once passed naturally within households were no longer practiced regularly, and without practice, they faded. Fonio did not disappear from fields entirely. It persisted in specific regions, cultivated quietly for household use or cultural events, but its presence in public discourse diminished. When a food loses its category within a system, it rarely vanishes at once. Instead, it becomes invisible, still grown, still eaten, but increasingly absent from the structures that determine what is considered viable food for the future. Fonio's decline was not the result of a single weakness, but of a mismatch between its strengths and the requirements of the system that replaced it. Modern agricultural economies are structured around predictability at scale. Crops are expected to respond consistently to inputs, to mature uniformly, and to move efficiently through centralized supply chains. Fonio does not behave this way. Its grains are small and variable, complicating mechanized harvesting. Dehusking requires specialized processes that have proven difficult to automate without damaging the grain. Yields fluctuate according to microconditions rather than increasing linearly with fertilizer or irrigation. For systems designed around economies of scale, this variability is costly. Storage and trade present further challenges. Fonio is best handled locally, processed close to where it is grown. It does not fit neatly into bulk storage models optimized for rice or wheat. Nor does it benefit from the same global commodity markets that reward uniformity and volume. In a system where profitability depends on throughput, crops that favor resilience over standardization are sidelined. This does not mean fonio failed agronomically. It failed institutionally. Agricultural investment favors crops that absorb capital, seeds, machinery, irrigation, chemicals, because these inputs create measurable growth and economic circulation. Fonio requires little of this. Its low input nature, once an advantage, became a reason for exclusion. A system built to reward control and repetition struggles to accommodate crops designed for variability. In that context, fonio's reliability became invisible, while its incompatibility with scale was treated as deficiency. The grain did not stop working. It simply stopped fitting. As climate patterns shift, the assumptions that once justified fonio's exclusion are becoming less stable. Across the Sahel, rainfall has grown more variable, with longer dry spells punctuated by intense, unpredictable storms. Cropping systems built around steady water availability and precise timing show increasing vulnerability under these conditions. Irrigation-dependent cereals, once promoted as secure, now face rising costs and growing risk. In this context, fonio has begun to reappear, not as a solution, but as a reference point. Researchers and institutions concerned with climate risk have noted its tolerance for poor soils, its short growing cycle, and its ability to mature under limited rainfall. Food and agriculture. Organization assessments of climate variable agriculture increasingly acknowledge the limits of uniform strategies in regions defined by uncertainty. Fonio's agronomic profile aligns closely with those constraints. Yet this renewed attention remains cautious. Fonio is not being positioned as a replacement for dominant cereals, nor as a universal answer to food insecurity. Its processing challenges remain. Its yields, while reliable, do not scale easily. Integrating it into existing supply chains would require structural adjustments that current systems are slow to make. The tension is not technical, but systemic. Crops like fonio are well adapted to environments shaped by variability, but modern agricultural frameworks are optimized for consistency. As climate stress increases, the gap between what ecosystems support and what institutions prioritize becomes more visible. Fonio's relevance today lies less in revival than in diagnosis. It exposes the limits of a food system built on control when conditions refuse to be controlled. The traits once dismissed now describe the environments many regions are entering, raising questions the system has yet to fully confront. Fonio's story does not resolve into a rediscovery narrative, nor into a call for return. It functions instead as a lens, one that reveals how agricultural systems define success and what they quietly discard in the process. For centuries, fonio operated outside the assumptions that now dominate global food planning. It did not require irrigation schemes, standardized inputs, or centralized processing. It worked by adapting to uncertainty rather than attempting to eliminate it. That adaptation was never hidden. It was observable, repeatable, and historically documented. Yet as agricultural priorities narrowed, traits that could not be optimized for scale lost institutional value. What endured biologically became peripheral economically. Fonio did not disappear because it failed tests of productivity or nutrition. It disappeared because it did not conform to a system increasingly designed around uniformity and expansion. Today, its continued existence complicates the narrative that progress follows a single agricultural trajectory. It suggests that some capacities, such as speed, resilience, and tolerance for variability, were deprioritized not because they lacked evidence, but because they did not align with prevailing models of efficiency. The grain's persistence in marginal spaces underscores that erasure does not require extinction. It can occur through classification, neglect, and silence. Whether systems will adapt to include such crops remains uncertain. Institutions tend to change slowly, even as conditions shift quickly. Fonio stands as a quiet reminder that alternatives have existed all along, not as solutions waiting to be adopted, but as evidence of paths once taken and later abandoned. The question it leaves open is not whether fonio should return, but whether modern food systems are capable of recognizing value that does not scale neatly. As climates grow less predictable and assumptions strain, the distance between what has worked historically and what is currently prioritized continues to widen, without clear indication of which will give way first.